What's up, guys? It's Sam. We be giving y'all my final. Um, Basically, like, in some ways, my reflection of, our African American literature class. And the question that I'm gonna be attempting to answer is, what does the study of African American literature reveal about people's individual and collective American identity and culture in general? Just to give you guys my abstract and raw thoughts, I believe first and foremost to be American is in some way, shape, or form to be black. And what I mean by that is if we pay attention to what the African has done for America culturally, socially, economically, financially, architecturally, in terms of labor, to be American essentially is to be black in some way, shape, or form. And I feel like this idea of blackness, it can be seen anywhere among any social group. It's so many, different cultural and ethnic groups that mimic blackness. Even among those who are said to be white, in some ways they, whether that's through a means of exploitations, they need this black hand, this black identity of some sorts, whether that's through taken from black creations, black ideas, and then, putting a white face or a white name on it, essentially to be American, to relish an American identity, American culture, you have to, in some way, shape, or form, identify with blackness, use blackness. Like, blackness is the catalyst, the crux, the criteria for American identity, for whiteness. If whiteness is gonna be the antonym to blackness, whiteness is still related to, connected to, correlated to blackness. Topic. And I'm just gonna give you guys my overview on like a lot of things today. So first I wanna talk about, Toni Morrison's U2U, and I'm talking about module 1. So I believe Morrison, through the Unspeakable Things Unspoken, transverse, and, enlightened me to another level. She kind of, in some ways, gave me an origin of what this idea of blackness is and how is blackness, being viewed among the white gaze, middle class white America, how are African Americans being used. And she compares, black people to this term of cannon fodder. And basically saying, black people are like in some ways second class citizens to Americans. We're in some ways like bastards to Americans. We're used and then discarded, essentially. And I feel like Morrison essentially is trying to find, the African American identity, and she's trying to convey to, the debaters and the scholars who normally come up with the principle or the rule for, what is or isn't the standard for the canon, in the American literature classroom, in the American literature scholarship. What is the canon in blackness? African Americans, Africans in general, have never been in remotely in that sphere. White people, they hide behind this colorblind veil because to be racist in a society overtly is, no longer requires, no longer needed. We live in a society that white people don't have to overtly call you the N-word. They don't have to overtly call you, a racial epithet. They have institutions, they have, other means to exercise how they feel towards black people. And if you study the institutions, if you study the society on different class levels, you see, the racial paradigm, how they really feel about black people. So, they hide behind this pervasive colorblind veil, as, E.B. Du Bois would say. It's a veil that they hide behind, that they refuse to, confront their real feelings, because it's not marketable to be racist overtly anymore, to have racial prejudice anymore. To use that power is not marketable. So again, Morrison, she basically speaks to me in some ways. She speaks to how Black people have been ostracized. We have been alienated from, the American classroom, our presence as a people. The fact that we have so many cultural groups that aren't expressed in, the white institutions that majority of us go to, it dehumanizes us. It detaches us from our reality of being Black, of being brown, of being red, and it makes us in some ways indoctrinated. It makes us in a lot of ways, assimilated just to, again, this racial paradigm, the predominant society. So yeah. One quote just to back that notion would be Afro-American presence in African-American literature that required neither slaughter nor reification, views that may spring the whole literature of an entire nation from the solitude in which it has been locked. There is something called American literature that, according to the conventional wisdom, is not Chicano literature, African American literature, Asian American literature, Native American literature, or it is somehow separate from those, and they from it. And in spite of the efforts of recent literary histories, the structured curricula and anthologies of these separate confinements, be it breached or endorsed, is like the subject of a large part of these debates. Like the vocabulary of earlier canon debates referred to literature and humanistic values, aesthetic criteria, value-free or socially anchored readings. The contemporary battle plane is most often understood to be claims of others against the white male origin and definitions of those values. And just to further go on, I feel like Morrison really attacks this idea of this colorblind veil. She's almost like an advocate for African American identity and culture. Because herself being an African American woman, she sees how this indoctrination process of conditioning us to only value whiteness and to not even mention Blackness, it reinforces this hidden agenda that Black people, Black children somehow get to where they end up eventually loathing themselves, not valuing themselves and their people. And it's very apparent once you begin to really digest Morrison's work and what she's saying. And she just furthermore alludes to this idea that to be American is essentially to be in some shape or form Black, some shape or form brown, some shape or form red, yellow, and even white. But where I want to go is to be American is to be Black. Because essentially, Morrison goes on and she alludes to how white people have created their own identity. They have created their own culture. The Greeks created their own culture. The Greeks, the Romans, they stole from African identity, African culture. And, Morrison alludes to this notion. She articulates this notion a lot. And there's even a quote from this. And she says, a large part of the satisfaction I've always received from reading Greek tragedy, for example, is in its similarity to Afro-American communal structures, the function of songs and chorus, the heroic struggle between the claims of community and individual purpose, African religion and philosophy. In other words, that is part of the reason it has quality for me. I feel intellectually at home there. There was another part. One has the feeling that nights are becoming sleepless in some quarters, and it seems to me obvious that the recoil of this traditional humanist and some postmodern theorists to this particular aspect of the debate, the race debate, the race aspect, excuse me, is as severe as it is because it claims for attention come from the segment of scholarly and artistic labor in which the mention of race is either inevitable, elaborately, painstakingly masked, and if all the ramifications that the term demanded are taken seriously, the basis of Western civilization will require rethinking. And again, that's very, I feel, important. Then she goes more into depth with this idea. Thus, in spite of this implicit and explicit acknowledgement, race is still a virtually unspeakable theme, as can be seen in apologies and notes of special use, circumscribed definitions that accompany it. Race does not exist. For 300 years, Black Americans insisted that race was no usefully distinguishing factor in human relationships. During those same 3 centuries, every academic discipline, including theology, history, natural science, insisted that race was a determining factor in human development. When Blacks discovered that they had shaped or become a culturally formed race, and that it has specific revered difference, suddenly they were told that there was no such thing as race, biologically or culturally, that matters, that the genuinely intellectual exchange cannot accommodate it. And then she goes on to say that it seemed to me that the people who invented the hierarchy of race, when it was convenient for them, ought not to be the ones to explain it away now that it does not suit their purposes for it to exist. And that, goes back to this idea of, white people and whiteness. It's not marketable, it's not acceptable in society. They don't have to be, racist or have racial prejudices towards, Black and brown people of color, because it's not marketable. It's not convenient for them to do so anymore. And so we come back to this idea of to be American is to be Black, in my estimate. So, and I feel like Toni Morrison, she kind of alludes to that notion. She kind of alludes to this idea to be a human is to be, African, to be anything is to be, Black, in a sense. To be African American, to be anything means that you have to be everything. And to be everything, you have to identify that, you have to include these people that you have neglected and marginalized, you have repressed and suppressed for such a long time. And that's what myself and Morrison feel about white people. So she states, and it took some 70 years to accomplish, 70 years to eliminate Egypt as the cradle of civilization and its model and replace it with Greece. The triumph of that process was that Greece lost its own origins and became itself original. A number of scholars in various disciplines have put forward their research into cross-cultural and intercultural transmissions with varying degrees of success of their work. She goes on to state, the other sees it as the Leviathan absorbed by the Egyptian and Semitic culture, the ancient model. If I am right, writes Professor Bernal, in urging to overthrow the Aryan model and replace it by the revised ancient one, it will be necessary not to rethink the fundamental basis of Western civilization, i.e. white civilization, but also to recognize the penetration of racism and continental chauvinism into all of our histography, philosophy, and writing history. The ancient model had no major internal deficiencies or weaknesses in its explanatory power. It was overthrown for external reasons, i.e. white. For 18th and 19th century romantics and races, it was simply intolerable for Greece, basically to believe that everybody came from Africa, just to keep a proper timeline, which was not seen merely as the epitome of Europe, but also as pure childhood, to have been the result of a mixture of native Europeans and colonizing Africans and Semites. Therefore, the ancient model had to be overthrown and replaced by something more acceptable. And then Morrison goes into Egyptomania, and she just talks about a lot of things that gave me like a powerful insight into, myself, my origins as a Black critical scholar and as an African American, as an African. So then we can go into the text, heritage. And Heritage by Gwendolyn Bennett was like one of the it kind of changed the way I thought again. Just to think like people in the people in the 20th and the 19th century, late 19th century, were conceiving these ideas about Africa. And obviously it wasn't up until the not the World War, but the scramble for Africa. It wasn't until that time that Black people really started understanding where the Black people come from. And it was just very interesting to see like a primary source, a historical primary source, that being a poem, a piece of literature of a woman, yearning to see her people like living free, peacefully, liberated. And she uses a lot of metaphors, and she uses a lot of figurative language to convey this sense of yearning to see her people that look like her being in Africa, being where they're supposed to be, and living free away from the encounters of Europeans, essentially. And it really just transversed my thinking again. It embraced this idea of Sankofa. This idea of Sankofa, essentially, having to eat for the Sankofa bird reminds African people that sometimes we have to look at our past for us to go forward. So the bird would often get food from its back to feed itself. So acknowledging that we have things in our past, we have things behind us, and we have to always pay homage. We have to always be mindful of those things so we can move forward. And, going through the modules, it was just a lot of interesting conversations that I had with a lot of people. I know module 1, I had a lot of good conversations with people. Things just like using like certain racial epithets, like referring to our ancestors, or if they weren't your ancestors, people that were enslaved as slaves, things of that nature. It's just a lot of good dialogue and discourse about the pieces of literature that we learned for those weeks. I know module, I believe 2 was one of my favorites by far. We talked about the narrative life of Frederick Douglass and incidents of the life of a slave girl. I focused a lot on what constitutes canonical literature. Talked about a lot about how the African slave trade was really a genocide, and the effects of that genocide on African people. I talked a lot about how that isn't taught. People essentially don't know their history. They're disconnected from each other because we don't have like a commonality of like what happened to us, where we came from, in a sense. That kind of made us docile to some extent, and it kind of made us, dysfunctional human beings. It was just really great. It was a really great analysis. It was one of my favorite reads. Took a really long time to read. Unfortunately, I didn't really get to have a lot of discourse about it, but regardless, I really love talking about the pursuit of literacy. I feel like literacy is the way that, Black people will find peace and freedom, peace of mind and freedom of the body. So again, every piece of literature that we went over, I plan to use it in my future classroom. It might not be everything, but a lot of it, I feel like it's a gold mine. Basically, this course was going over and recovering African identity, African American identity. It started from, the enslavement process, to the enslavement period, to the emancipation period, to the New Negro movement, to the Renaissance movement. It was a timeline of what have Black people done. It was really a history course and a literature course. It really conveyed what is African American identity, what does it mean to be an American, can an African American even be an American, and what have African Americans done through their lineage and their heritage. And it was a really great summer class. I wish I could have took it for a semester. And just the amount of things that I learned within 8 weeks was beautiful, again, because it was a lot, but it was for a good reason. And I'm gonna continue with African and African American studies. I think it's called Africana Studies at Howard University. I plan on being an African American literature teacher on the secondary level in high school. I want kids to be able to experience this classroom, because I feel like this classroom is a necessity. A lot of these kids to develop, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be an African American historically and through, a literary lens? Eventually I also want to teach Africana studies. But it's a lot of propagandizing regarding, Black life, essentially, Black history. They don't want to teach that. They don't want people to know about themselves because of the resistance, the backlash, the guilt complex, of a sense. They don't want Black people, it parallels to like the enslavement period. They don't want us to be higher functional beings. They don't want us to criticize the society, which is why there's so much propagandizing of critical race theory and things of that nature, like the 1619 Project. It's very interesting. But yeah, this was my final, and I hope you guys enjoy it.